Good morning. Thank you to the students for joining us today. We are honored that you are here, and give them another hand. We're blessed. First weekend at campus, and also I want to be sure to stop and thank the president of the school, Dr. Tyner, and his wife Patty. They are here somewhere. Where are you? In the back, over there. They just honor Dr. Tyner and Patty. We are so blessed to have our relationship with them as well. My name is Pastor Russ, and it is a privilege to be a part of the community of City Church. And we have two traditions that we try to work on. One of our traditions is I'm not allowed to start a sermon with a really powerful dad joke. So I'm wondering if you know the difference between a hippo and a zippo. One is really heavy and the other is just a little lighter. Okay. Secondly, it takes so many volunteer hours, incredible volunteer hours, to pull off what we do here each week and during the week. And being a mobile church, there's a lot of creativity throughout the week of where we host different meetings and gatherings and invest in people. It takes a myriad of hours to pull this off. And so we try each month to at least stop and recognize an individual that has just served above and beyond and take time to really appreciate our volunteer culture that happens around here. And so today, if I could just take a minute, and where is Jessica Newsom? Jessica, where are you? Are you in the house? Where is she? Is she not here? Well, she's not so good at what she does anyway. So, there she is. Come here, girl. Come here. You don't know this or not, but you're the volunteer of the month. Don't tell anyone. We're so glad you're here. And you do so much, and your heart is so right. You're faithful, you're loyal, you're humble, you're teachable. All that makes up, but man, you're determined to make a difference in people's lives. And we're so glad you're a part of the community of City Church. I just want to give you a token of gratitude. Please grab something from the merch table and know that we value you so much. Thank you, Jessica. You're awesome. Bless you, girl. Bless you. We are honored. If you have a copy of God's Word, or whether on your phone or in paper, if you would find the book of Hebrews real quickly, the book of Hebrews, we have been on a journey, a collection of talks called Beyond the Bleachers, and today we're wrapping up that series of Beyond the Bleachers, and we're going to land in the book of Hebrews. It's in the New Testament, and we're going to just kind of journey through. I always have a happy, sad moment when we conclude a collection of talks that I really believe in and pour myself into. And it's always exciting to see what the fruit of that labor is, and it's always kind of sad to say goodbye to what we've done in the last few weeks. So today is one of those emotional mixed days. If you're in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, if you're at Hebrews 12, will you do me a favor? Will you stand one more time? We like to honor God's Word at City Church as we break into it. Hebrews 12, verse 1. Hebrews 12, verse 1. It reads, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us." Lord, I just pray right now that you would speak louder than me, that your Spirit would be the voice that makes a difference today. I thank you that you use me, but man, go beyond my ability and speak to every heart in the house. Lord, I pray today we don't just walk through this part of the Word, but it changes our lives and equips us to influence every person we meet towards your kingdom. In all City Church said, amen. You may be seated. Thank you. We've been on this journey of Beyond the Bleachers, and we all know there's coaches that sit in the bleachers. There's coaches that always think they know what's best. They know who should run what play. They make comments like, that coach should know better. If I was a coach, I would do this. Who would ever let that person play? It's interesting that in America, the people that think they're the best coaches in the nation are the ones sitting on the couch burping queso and pulling a hamstring, reaching for the remote. There is a statement that I discovered that I didn't realize was as active as it is, and it's a term called an armchair activism. Armchair activism. Here's the definition: someone that expresses an opinion but is unwilling to take meaningful action or make a personal sacrifice. Armchair activism. I think if we're honest, all of us practice armchair activism on a daily basis. I wonder how many have ever told the person in front of you how to drive? Exactly. Or how many of us have decided that we could certainly direct traffic better with the cones than the way they currently have the cones set up? We all have parts of our lives where we are armchair activists, where we express an opinion, but we're really not certain we want to get personally involved or cost us anything. Well, today I want to take us on a journey and just talk about this crowd of witnesses that we read about, and how they stepped out of the bleachers and made a difference in lives. As we look at Hebrews, it's an interesting book, the book of Hebrews. We don't really know who wrote the book. We don't know the author. It's insinuated or believed in some streams that it was written by the Apostle Paul. And that belief stems from just the writing style of the book of Hebrews. It's written in very much the way I communicate. It's written in run-on sentences. And that was kind of Paul's style, and in his other work was he would just write run-on sentences. And so it's a similar system in Hebrews, but we really don't know who wrote Hebrews. And I think that it's the positive of not knowing who wrote that is the message of Hebrews, where we're going to look at a minute in Hebrews chapter 11, names many heroes of the faith. And this individual who wrote Hebrews, we don't know who wrote it, but they're sure to point out those that got out of the bleachers, and then makes that statement: look at Jesus, not me. It's a great book. It's a consequential book, even though we don't know the author. In the chapter just before what we read in chapter 12, in chapter 11, there are 18 Old Testament heroes that are mentioned by name in chapter 11. Not only are there 18 Old Testament heroes mentioned in chapter 11, but there's numerous unnamed heroes in chapter 11. It talks about prophets that are heroes. It talks about women that were heroes. It talks about prisoners that were heroes. It talks about the persecuted that were heroes. It talks about the martyrs that were heroes, the unnamed that stepped out of the bleachers and did something that changed somebody else's lives. It's numerous, the heroes of the faith that are talked about in chapter 11. And then chapter 11 concludes, and let's read together. It'll be on the screen what the author of Hebrews says about these heroes. He says in verse 38, they were too good for this world. That is such a compelling statement. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. Now, we're going to pick up again, but let me just land on that, because we could ask the question, see, I didn't get what God promised. No, the key in there, they didn't get all that God promised, because God promised that they would influence to the end of the earth, and we are the end of their earth. So they are still receiving their promise by each one of us that are walking in our relationship, this faith walk with Jesus. Then we pick up where we read, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses, to the life of faith that we strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. I'd like to read to you that same portion out of the Bible from what's called the Message translation. Let me read the Message to you. It reads like this. Do you see what this means? All these pioneers who blazed the way, all these veterans cheering us on, it means we'd better get on with it. Strip down, not literally, just, start running, never quit, no extra spiritual fat, no parasitic sins. Keep your eyes on Jesus, who both began and finished this race that we are in. Study how he did it. It's so important that he's the example, and that's why he had the invitation called follow me. Follow me is one of the most extravagant and yet intimate invitations that's ever been expressed. These from chapter 11, they never received everything that God promised, but they gave God everything they had. And today we are what they dreamt of and more. If you're in this room, that's a dumb statement, you're in this room. Those of you in this room, you are somebody's answer to prayer. You are today in this room fulfilling a promise somebody was made. If you don't leave here encouraged in any other way, be encouraged by the fact that you are an answer to prayer that perhaps was prayed a generation or two ago. And today, here you are. These saints, they wandered through deserts. They went over mountains. They lived in caves. They served in holes as they lived out their faith. And some of us refused to even leave the comfort of the bleachers to make a difference. They ran their lap of life, never seeing the finish line, so that they can cheer us on and join us on our finish line. One of the highlights that I love in life, I love to run, and I try each year to run a half marathon up in Missoula, Montana. And I remember about the third half marathon that I ran, as I finished and crossed the finish line, there are people, when you run a distance race, and there's people on the other side of the finish line, and there's people that have medals, and they put a medal around your neck for completing the run, and there's people handing out water, and there's people with food, nutrition to give you some energy after the run, and there's a first aid station. And I remember crossing the finish line, I think it was the third one, and I crossed the finish line, and this little gal took the medal and put it around my neck, and she said, "We did it!" And I'm like, "No, we didn't. You stood here, I did it." And the people handing out the water are like, "We are so glad that we did this with you. You didn't do it with me." But that's kind of what's happening here, is these heroes of the faith, they want that. They want us to say to them, "We did it. We did it. We completed the race." I wonder what would happen if we pulled some of these heroes of the faith out of the bleachers. We read that there's a huge crowd cheering us on. And if you ever have been, and I'm sure most of you that have been in any kind of an athletic event, when you're in an arena or perhaps a stadium, and the stands are full, and there's people yelling, and there's different shouts, and there's different cheers going on, it's very, very difficult to dial in and just hear one voice or to hear one person. It's such a loud, extreme noise that you really don't even know, except for maybe the home crowd, am I being cheered for or against? So I hope today that we can pull a few heroes of the faith out of the bleachers to walk a lap of life with us. Some of these stories today you may be familiar with. I hope that in that familiarity I can draw some nuances. I can point out some promises. I can bring some encouragement that perhaps you've not seen in those that jumped out of the bleachers for our success today. I think if we could invite these heroes to run a lap of life with us, if we began to walk through this arena of huge crowd that's cheering for us, I think we could fix our eyes in an individual that would be standing among the crowd. And as we look at him, well, he's wearing a priestly gown, very, very ornate and beautiful, and all the gems that the high priests would wear around their neck, and of course the hat that would describe their position, and someone that we would look at and say that we esteem them, and they have great value and great influence, and perhaps we'd stop and go, man, that person, and we would realize that this person's name is Zechariah. Zechariah was the father of a guy that we know as John the Baptist. I believe as we brought Zechariah out of the stands of faith and he ran a lap of life with us, I believe that he began to tell his story to us. He would say, as we walk this lap of life, let me explain to you what happened in my life. See, in antiquity, the high priest was drawn by lot. And they were drawn a year before they would serve. Before they would serve during the Passover, just before Easter, as we call it today, for a year, they would purify themselves so that on Passover they could confess the sins of Israel. So they would spend that year, Zechariah would explain to us that he spent a year just having to stay pure. He couldn't be around any people really for the year, because according to the law, the Levitical law, if he touched someone that had touched a dead person, it defiled him. He had to be very careful not to get defiled. He had to be very careful what he even thought about, because even the most nuanced thought that could insult his purity to be in a position to confess the sins of Israel would disqualify him. He had to spend most of his time at night alone, because there would be less people, and he knew that it would be less chance that he would ever encounter someone that might cause him to be defiled for the call on his life. He spent that year preparing to confess the sins of Israel, prayed, asked God, Yahweh, help me to be in a position that I can confess the sins of Israel for the nation. For a year he prepares for this. And Zechariah, when he went into the temple and he went behind the veil in what's called the Holy of Holies, as he stepped behind the Holy of Holies, he's met by an angel. And in the book of Luke chapter 1, it says, the angel said, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will call him John." Now, let's not overlook the power of this message. Of course, Zechariah has every thought in his mind of, wait. I have for the last year prepared to come here to confess the sins of Israel. For the last year, my wife's going to have a child. I've not even touched my wife in over a year. I've not even thought about intimacy with my wife for over a year. And the first message I get is I'm going to have a son. Well, if I had time, I would dissect it more clearly for you, but the essence of the message from the angel was this: because you stepped out of the bleachers, because of your obedience, the prayer you no longer pray is about to be answered. I think Zechariah would want us to know that our prayers don't expire. I think as Zechariah, perhaps at the end of our lap of life, when he began to go back up the stairs of the bleachers to his posture, I think his final statement as he went partway up, he might turn around and look down and say to us, silence from heaven does not mean your prayer has been erased. It means the answer is being timed for greater purpose. I think he would want us to get out of the bleachers and know that it's for a greater purpose. As he goes back and takes his seat, I think we would scan this huge crowd, and perhaps our eyes would fall on this other individual. He kind of looks like, he kind of looks like the weird uncle that comes over for dinner. And it's because he is. This guy Mordecai was Esther's uncle. Esther, the book of Esther is an interesting book. The word God is not even mentioned in the book of Esther, but yet it's in the Bible. And we've called the book of Esther, so Esther's kind of the hero, but there's this story of her uncle Mordecai. Esther was taken into the king's harem, and she had to serve in that capacity. And Mordecai, his job was to sit at the city gates. He would sit at the city gates and be part of the conversation and the leadership of the city. And one day at the city gates, he heard this guy Haman begin talking how that they could wipe out all the Hebrew people and have complete control of the known world, not even realizing what the economic impact that would have and all the other influences that would happen in the kingdom if that were to happen. And Mordecai heard this happening, so Mordecai took a step. He stepped out of the bleachers to preserve a people, to put himself as a sacrificial place, and he reported what he heard. Well, there's this king, Xerxes, and king can't sleep one night, so he calls his scribe in, and he says to his scribe, hey, read to me what's happened in my 72 provinces lately. I don't know everything. Read it to me. So the scribe begins to read what's happened in the provinces lately. And the scribe reads about this guy Mordecai who saved the Hebrew people and continues to read. And the king goes, wait a minute, back up. Did we ever reward Mordecai? So the scribe faithfully looks through the annals of time and says, no, it's not recorded. I guess we didn't. At the same time, Haman that night is at home with his mom and his best friend. And he's complaining. He's complaining that Mordecai won't honor him. Haman's kind of a little mama's boy. He's complaining. Mordecai won't bow to me. Mordecai won't honor me. What am I going to do, Mama? I don't want to go back to youth group. Mama says, Mordecai, I got a great idea. Here's what we do. Go to the center of the city, build a 75-foot gallows, and hang Mordecai from it. Then everyone in the city will know. You won't have to wipe out all the Hebrews. They'll know that you're the guy to be honored. Mordecai's like, Mom, great idea. I love you, Mom. He goes out and begins to build in the center of the city this 75-foot gallows. The king finishes his conversation with the scribe and he says, hey, we never honored Mordecai? No, we didn't. The king says, listen, go out. The first person you see, bring him in. The scribe steps out. There's Mordecai building the gallows. He says, Haman building the gallows. The scribe says, hey, Haman, king wants you, has an appointment with you. Haman's like, yes. I'm so in. He walks in and the king says, Haman, thank you for joining us. Hey, Haman, I have a question. If you wanted to honor someone in the kingdom, really honor someone in the kingdom, what would you do? Haman is like, this is awesome. King, you know what I'd do? I would have them wear a robe, one of your robes, a robe you've worn in public, a robe that everybody would recognize. I'd have them wear one of your robes in public. The king is like, Haman, so smart. What else? What else would you do? King, this is so good for me. I would put them on one of your stallions, a stallion that you've ridden in public, that people would know that this is your stallion. As they're wearing your robe, they're riding your stallion in public. That's what I would do to honor that person. King is like, Haman, you just keep getting better. Such a good idea. What else? What else? What else would you do? Haman is like, I can't believe I get to write my own inheritance here. What I would do, King, is I would put them in one of your robes, set them on a horse, and I would have someone lead that horse through the kingdom yelling, this is the one the king honors. This is the one the king honors. King looks at Haman and says, that is brilliant. Go do that for Mordecai. I think as Mordecai tells us his story of life and we end our lap with him and he begins to go up in the bleachers, I think he'd turn around and say, if the enemy has gone ahead and is planning your destruction, the king is ahead of him and has prepared your destiny. Step out of the bleachers. As we say goodbye to Mordecai, we kind of scan and we look over and we see this guy. He's kind of a blue-collar looking guy. Got working hands, blisters and slivers, and knows how to use tools. I don't. He does. He's got tools. And he's kind of built. He's worked hard. Clearly a hard-working guy. Like, man, who's that guy up there? And you pause for a moment and you realize that's Noah. No, that's no way. Noah, come on down. Noah begins to walk a lap of life with us, and I can hear Noah begin to tell his story, how he stepped out of the bleachers. He's just doing life. I mean, good grief, he's 500 years old. And God shows up and says, Noah, it's going to rain. Noah is like, I don't know what that is. It's never rained. God's like, that's okay. I need you to build a boat. I don't know what that is. I don't know how to build a boat. God says, that's all right. We got you. Noah would say to us, listen, it took me 100 years to build something I've never seen for something that's going to happen I've never heard of. Oh, doesn't that kind of remove our excuses? Oh, I can't serve in City Kids. I don't know the curriculum. Oh, you want me to greet people? I like talking to people, but I don't like talking to people. Oh, my neighbor who seems to be depressed and broken, you want me to really? You want me to do something I never done before? Really? And then Noah would share that took 100 years to build the boat, and then originally God said it was going to rain 40 days. Well, I didn't know that I had to wait for the water to go away. I'm stuck on this boat for 377 days before I get off the boat. And Noah would say to us, do you know what it's like to spend 377 consecutive days with 7 people from your family? And all of the animal dung? And you're trying to keep the lions from eating the kangaroos? I got to admit, when I got off the boat, I got a little tipsy. I celebrated. I think we'd be encouraged by his story, but as he began to finish the lap and he went back up into his place, this blue-collar, 500-year-old man, I think he'd turn around and his last message to us would be, oh, and by the way, age doesn't matter. Ask the little boy who gave up his lunch. And we're faced with that decision. Will I get out of the bleachers and serve what I don't know how to serve? Or will I at least be willing to give up my lunch? It was quite a conversation with Noah. But then our eyes kept going by this individual. He's clearly someone significant. When he stands, there's people around him who are kind of in awe. Like there's a reverence. Like we all know that kind of a person, don't we? They just walk in the room and they're just like, who? That is somebody. He's stately and mature, clearly an influencer, and clearly has the honor of the room, true integral honor. So we, confused in this, we listen to the crowd yell and we finally ask, who's that? And they say, well, that's Abraham, the father of the faith. Like, I'd like to do a lap with Abraham. So he comes out of the bleachers, and we read how he stepped out of the bleachers of life. Hebrews 11:11, it says this about Abraham. It was by faith that even Sarah, Abraham's wife, was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. Can I just tell you something? If the Bible says you're too old, there's not a lot of hope. She was too old, so listen to this next line. One of the most compelling of the whole book. She believed that God would keep his promise. Verse 12, and so a whole nation, listen to this one, came from this one man who was as good as dead. Oh, I'm feeling good about myself right now. I have this conversation with God. Hey, Abraham, you're going to have kids. Really? Yeah. However, Abraham, you're as good as dead. And Sarah, she's too old. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there's no way to count them. I think Abraham would say to us, until my ability was as good as dead, his promise couldn't come alive. This stately father of the faith, it's an honor to do a lap of life with, had a name change, and really just a name change. Throughout the Bible, we read how God changed people's names. He changed Jacob to Israel, and New Testament, he changed Simon to Peter. It was kind of one of the ways that God functioned, and when he would give a new creation, he'd give a new name. But there's something different about Abram. Because we remember back to that Noah guy. All part of the story that he shared with us was that after he got off the boat, after he spent 100 years building the boat and 377 days on the boat, when he got off the boat, done dealing with the family, done dealing with animals, we find him naked and drunk. Which I got to confess, I probably would have done it too. And his son Ham finds him in his tent, naked and drunk, passed out, and begins to mock him. So Ham goes and finds his two brothers. Hey guys, Dad, woo! He was on the boat too long. You should see him, naked and drunk. The two brothers took a blanket and they backed into the tent to honor their father and covered him with a blanket, restored him. And when he found out what happened, he called Ham. And of course, they're only people on the planet, so they all are being given a piece of land that they are to develop. And he says to Ham, you are cursed, and the land of Canaan is cursed along with you because of your mockery. Ham. Generations later, we read about this father of the faith called Abraham, who was sent to the promised land called Canaan. What? Since when is a cursed piece of land a promised land? When God honors you stepping out of the bleachers, that's when. Genesis is so clear. It says that God said, no longer will you be called Abram. He said, I'm going to have you redeem what was cursed. So we're going to change your name to Abraham. Redeem the generations because you were willing to step out of the bleachers and be the father of the faith. I think as we completed that lap of life with our father of the faith, this stately, brilliant influencer of generations, I think he'd turn around and say, listen, I want to share something with you. God named me according to my destiny, not according to my reality. The truth is, I think his final words to me and you would be, your obedience can redeem the failures of generations that were before you by rewriting the legacy to serve those that will come after you. I, like probably many of you, had to break off generational addictions and abuses and failures. But I know that what God promised Abraham is available to you and I today if we'll get out of the bleachers. If we could take the time to perhaps walk a lap of life with one more hero, this huge crowd of witnesses, if we could walk a lap of life with one more hero, I think as we walk in, and we've been watching this individual the whole time, and this guy just stands up there, and man, there's just something about him, like he's loud, and he's tripping over the bleachers, and he's always cheering, and the guy's slightly obnoxious, and he's eating a hot dog, and he has mustard going down his shirt, and he's clamoring to get that ice cold drink, and everybody's kind of laughing and yucking it up at the guy, and we just kind of stop and go, who is that guy? I like that guy. Who is that guy with the hot dog? Now, somebody asked me first service, was it kosher? I don't know. Who's the guy with the hot dog? And they would say, oh, that's Peter. Yes. I'd like to do a lap of life with Peter. How cool is that? Peter comes down and begins to walk this lap of life, and he tells us the story. tells us the time that he walked on the water, and he tells us the time that he got out of the boat, and he tells us the time that he cut off a dude's ear, and he tells us all about this lap of life. And then he brings us to what maybe was the real lesson, the real core of what Peter would give us today. In John chapter 18, it says this. It says, because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around that charcoal fire, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them at the charcoal fire, warming himself. And it was at that charcoal fire that Peter denied Christ the third time. It was at that charcoal fire that Peter cursed Christ. It was at that charcoal fire that he and the kindness of God's eyes connected. And Peter went into what says a bitter weeping. As he tells us how 3 times at the charcoal fire he denied Christ. Jesus, after that, is put on the cross and is in the grave for 3 days. And Peter and the other 10 guys, the 11, because Judas is now dead, and he was their best friend. He lived with them for 3.5 years, and he committed suicide. I'm sure that the 11 of them were mourning the loss, and how did they not see it? And what could they have done to help Judas? And why did this have to happen on our watch? And man, we feel bad for Judas. And Peter's like, man, I was close myself. I was in a real place of bitterness too. And plus they're mourning their Messiah, their hope. The Redeemer is gone. He's dead. He's in a grave. What are we going to do? And Peter goes, I know what we're going to do. We're going to go fishing. Fishing fixes everything. Let's just go fishing. So they go fishing throughout the night. And the next morning, Jesus shows up on the beach. And he shouts to the 11 boys out in the boat, hey, throw your net on the other side. Let me know how you do. The harvest is so big, nets start breaking. And Peter goes, deja vu. That's Jesus. Puts on his coat, jumps in the water, runs through the water, gets up and finds Jesus on the beach. What does Jesus have waiting for them? Jesus is so amazing. It says in 3 chapters later, verse 21, or chapter 21, it says, when they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them. Now, if it's me, you're eating an Eggo waffle. They found breakfast waiting for them. Jesus has this conversation with Peter. Peter, do you love me? Yeah, I do, Lord. Feed my lambs. Pete, you love me? Yeah, I do. Feed my sheep. Peter, on this lap of life, would say, he asked me 3 times, Pete, do you love me? I said the 3rd time, I said this to him. I said, you know I do. And he said to me, feed my sheep. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire. This is the only place in the entire Bible where the words charcoal fire are mentioned, at his failure and at his redemption. Because God is so good, he'll take you to where you think you're weakest and point out your greatest strength. David, if you'll come up. Jesus didn't call him to the banks to disqualify him. He didn't call him to the banks to break him down. He brought him to heal him and to commission him. I believe Peter showed up on that bank wanting to gravely apologize for his failure, but instead he left carrying responsibility. I think as we complete this lap of life with Peter, as he began to go back up where his hot dog and cold drink were waiting for him, I think he would say, between the two charcoal fires, Jesus restored me. Jesus fed me. Jesus trusted me. Jesus commissioned me. I'm getting out of the bleachers. And then I can see him about 3 steps up, stop. Turn around and say, because he restored me, I spent the rest of my life discovering what it meant to feed his sheep. And you and I today are part of his promise. Because he was redeemed. At the charcoal fire. Will you stand? Prayer team, if you'll come forward. I'm going to ask in this moment if you'd be still for this moment. Pastor Katie will dismiss us shortly. But please just be with me for 2 more minutes. I want to conclude in 2 fashions, both of which, if you'll do me the privilege, if you just bow your heads and close your eyes, and in the solitude of the space that you stand in. Perhaps today, the beginning of stepping out of the bleachers is just saying, man, Jesus, I need you in my life. I need a relationship with you. Maybe you've prayed it 100 times, or maybe today this is a foreign message and the first time you've heard about this relationship with Jesus who calls us past our failures. If I'm talking to you and today's the day where you make that invitation once again or one for the first time, I'm going to ask if nothing weird, I'm going to ask you on the count of 3 if you'll raise your hand that I can pray with you. Why do I ask you to raise your hand? 1, because I do know that what we believe or feel on the inside gets solidified when I act on it on the outside. 2, this truly is the greatest decision you will ever make. 3, can I pray with you? Would you just slip your hand up? Pastor, today, pray for me. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. All the hands in there, just keep them up for 1 minute. One minute. I'm going to pray. There's no magic in my words. I'm going to pray over you. I ask that you would just agree with my prayer. If you would just say the word yes while I pray. Bible says I need to believe in my heart and confess with my tongue. That I just want to give you that moment to believe in your heart as you raise your hand. Confess with your tongue as I pray. No magic in my words. Just agree with me. Jesus, for those that have raised their hands right now, that you would introduce yourself, reintroduce yourself, that they would step out of the bleachers and remember that any failure they have, any exhaustion they've carried, any brokenness is redeemable, restorable, refreshing. Lord, right now, as they even just say, yes, come into their lives, forgive them, cleanse them, purify their thoughts, their mind, their heart, set them up for success, bring joy and hope back into their lives. That this morning, as they just say, yes, that's me. Today, I need to invite you in. I need to get out of the bleachers of what's held me back. Put great grace on them, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Listen, heaven right now is celebrating every one of you. Heaven is dancing, celebrating every one of you right now. Finally, we're going to wrap up with this. One more favor, please, with your head down and your eyes closed. Put your hand on your heart. And if you would just ask yourself, Lord, what are the bleachers of excuses I've made to not grow in you? As the band takes us through one last song, I challenge you to really ask him that question. What are my excuses? Would I be listed in Hebrews 11? And perhaps during the last song, if you need prayer for any reason whatsoever, whether it's discouragement you brought in or fear of tomorrow or a broken relationship or a financial breakthrough or a bad doctor's diagnosis, if there's anything that this team can pray with you on, man, don't leave in this last song without letting someone join you, look you in the eye, and let you know that you matter. And let him show you the bleachers we allow to hold us back from living this lap of life. David?